Hello, my name's Steve Cooney and I'm here in the Irish Traditional Music Archive in Merrion Square in Dublin, and we're here presenting to you this edition of Drawing from the Well. It came straight to my mind when I received the invitation to collaborate with two colleagues who I've worked with many times over the years. Firstly, Odhrán Casaide and also Iarla Lionáird. And one thing we have in common is the collection of Canon Seamus Goodman. Canon Seamus Goodman, or James Goodman, was born in 1828 and died in 1896. He was a Church of Ireland clergyman, a flute player, an uilleann piper and a collector of Irish music and songs. He was born in West Kerry and grew up near Dingle on the road to Ventry. Canon Goodman took up clerical positions in West Cork, particularly in Skibbereen, where there is a statue erected in his honour. His collections numbered over 2,000 tunes written in his notebooks between 1852 and 1866. Many of these were copied from other collectors, as was the practice at the time, but almost half were taken directly from the oral tradition, and his prime informant was the piper Tom Kenedy. Odhrán Casaide, Ursel, thank you for coming today, and you're going to explain to us a good bit about Goodman, because it was from you I first heard about Canon Seamus Goodman. I think it was 1993. You were taught by your father, Seamus Casaide, and Seamus Casaide was taught by Douglas Casaide, President of Ireland, and he was taught by Canon Seamus Goodman. So you have got it in a continuity through the oral tradition.
Thank you. My father always spoke about Canon Goodman and always spoke about the collection. It was from him that I got the inspiration to go and seek out more about it and get a copy of the microfilm of the collection. He told me that when he was a student in UCD, that Douglas Casaide was his professor of Irish. And of course we know that Douglas Casaide was a student of Goodman's. So there's a sort of a lineage there that I cherish, that
you're very lucky,
from Goodman to Hyde to my own father and then to myself. So I feel sort of in a very special way, connected to the music and to the collection.
And that's the oral tradition, isn't it, that we live within? The direct transmission.
But my father was always very conscious of the fact that this music had never been published, that it was sort of, in a sense, locked away. The manuscripts were not accessible, and therefore people knew very little about Goodman. We heard a lot about many of the great collectors, but Goodman at that time was, almost unknown, except in academic circles.
I think it wasn't until the Traditional Music Archive published the Goodman collection in 1998 that he became generally more well known throughout the traditional music community. Isn't that right?
Well, when I got in there and managed to get a copy of the microfilm in Trinity College, I couldn't believe my luck. But I then went home and managed to get a printout of it, and the treasures were just endless. And it became clear then that here was a recording or a manuscript notation of the music of an entire culture. Because Goodman was the only one who collected in that area of Ireland, and were it not for him, all that music would be lost.
And I think like Brendan Brannock had done some work on Goodman, but you were probably the only other person in Ireland apart from Brendan Brannock who was accessing the Goodman collection, I suppose, in the early 1990s or possibly even earlier.
Possibly so, and I don't think anybody else was working on it at the time. I was quite aware of the fact that there was something very different about the music. The more I looked at the contour of the melodies, they had like their own musical DNA. There's little turns, there's intervals, there's turn of phrases. There are aspects of the tunes that suggest to me a very distinct musical accent in terms of the melodic contour.
And because he was a piper himself, he was able to give an accurate description. Like, for example, there's one, is it called curls or curlicues or something, one of his numbers. He's showing you if you're playing between this interval and that interval, this is the roll that you do. If you're playing this interval to that interval, this is the snap or the crown that you do. So he detailed the ornamentation of every little note. And if one was studious enough, one could replicate exactly the ornamentations the pipers would have used.
Well, see, we're very lucky with Goodman because he was a native speaker of Irish. He was a flute player, and later he became a piper. He was also immersed in the folklore of his own community. He was the Goodmans were very accepted in their area. Even though they were Church of Ireland, they were very much part of the community and were regarded as such. There's an interesting, story told about when the whole super movement, the proselytizing was going on. Of course, this is something the Goodmans had absolutely nothing to do with. But there was a note left on Lord Ventry's door.
Stuck in with a dagger, I believe.
Was that it? Yeah. It was about somebody Gaynor who had come over to convert the native population, and it said something along the lines of, if you do not take Gaynor, away from here, I will drive a gunshot or balls through your carcass.
To Lord Ventry.
To Lord Ventry.
And then wasn't there a codicil?
And it signed a right good aim.
A right good aim. But then didn't it go on to say, except Canon Goodman, I leave him to you?
Parson Goodman is a good man, I leave him to you.
Yeah,
so that says a lot about him.
It does say a lot, yeah.
Yeah. So they're really blended into the community. They were part of the community. So you have this person who is, participating in his own culture, commenting on his own culture, and then collecting among his own people. And that's very important, because a lot of collecting that was done, somebody would come down from Dublin, would be a stranger, would speak with a strange accent, probably wouldn't have Irish, and to get the local people to sort of be forthcoming in that situation was probably difficult. And there are stories of sources sort of fleeing when somebody was coming towards the house. So Goodman was sort of collecting in his own environment. His sources were comfortable, and therefore we have this extraordinary collection.
And Odhrán, I think he was very influenced by the horrors of the famine that he had witnessed. He had lived through the famine, and I think he was afraid that the music that he had grown up with and had played with the local people was about to disappear because the people were disappearing.
Yeah, there is evidence to that in the fact that he was collecting a lot earlier than we think. For example, we know that he got a copy of An Buachal a Cael Dubh from Pádraig de Londra in 1847. So that puts it right in the middle of the famine.
The
height of the famine. And he states in his in the introduction to his first volume, he says, "The labour of writing has been rendered easy by my desire to preserve the music of my native province, which is fast becoming extinct."
And that was his imperative, to get as much of it down as he could.
Well, he obviously realised that not only were the people dying and leaving, but with them was the music and the culture.
Yeah. Now, Odhrán, I think we have evidence of that because now the collection was published by the Archive in 1998, but in 1994 you came down to West Kerry to perform, and I was performing with you at the, there was a Blasket Island Centre being built and it was being opened, and I had been commissioned by Lorcan of Kenedy to write a piece of music for the official opening. And I remember talking to you at the same time and asking you what you're up to, and you reminded me that you were working on the Goodman collection. So it was like, bing, come to Kerry, and we performed, I think, 6 pieces that night. And I think, to the best of my knowledge, that was the first time those tunes were heard in the area for over 100 years. But as part of the process of the performance, we decided to do a little informal research, I suppose, and we went out and you played them, these song airs to them on the violin, didn't you? And asked.
Well, I was full of the enthusiasm of the young researcher with my manuscripts under my arm. I was expecting that we'd be joyfully going through one tune after another, and it became very evident very quickly that while they recognised the titles, they didn't recognise the melodies. And almost all of the song airs were different, completely different.
Yeah, every one.
So they weren't sort of variants that you could still recognise the contour of the melody. These were almost different versions of melodies.
100% correct. And I remember writing about it in a paper that I was living in West Kerry, and I had lived there believing in the continuity of the ancient Gaelic song tradition. I was living in a situation where we were in this constant flow of the ancient tradition. And I had to realize, that day made me realize that Goodman was correct, his prediction was correct, though that those versions did become extinct and then was repopulated through the school system, and the airs, the more generic airs, came into the area and
I believe that, yeah.
That came as an awful surprise to me.
Well, it's clear that the variants of the songs that Goodman collected were no longer sung in that area in 1990 or in the early 90s.
So we owe him a great debt then, Odhrán, don't we, for preserving that thing.
I asked Micheál O'Sullivan once what could possibly have caused that, and he didn't speculate on the cause, but he said that the possibility was that it had died out and that the more normal versions of the songs were reintroduced possibly through the schools.
Through the schools, yeah. Very interesting, Odhrán, and tragic. But we're so grateful to Canon Goodman for doing what he did to collect it. Iarla, what would your response be to what Odhrán was talking about there?
Well, it's fascinating that you can go to a place and find that what was once the common musical language has disappeared entirely and has been supplanted by something else. And when we hear the minor investigations I've had the privilege of doing with you good folks into that particular collection, the Goodman collection, suggests that here are songs whose titles I know, whose words I may recognise, whose melody is entirely different, and with special characteristics that we can talk about. But there has to be some time with what you're saying, a community disappearing and taking with it entire swathes of knowledge.
I'm wondering, did that happen extensively in other parts of the country too? Because because Joyce comments on the famine as well. He comments on the terrible silence of the famine.
That's right.
But
and
he also
Petrie as well.
And Petrie.
Petrie, yeah. But Joyce in particular talks about how customs died out, like card playing, people singing spontaneously, and all the musical activities. That they all died out, and that things weren't the same after the famine.
Because, of course, the descriptions of social life in Ireland prior to the famine are of a very rich, diverse, and a kind of a sense of an effervescence of oral, compositional, performative culture. Yeah. It's almost hard to believe some of the descriptions you read about the way people were given to extempore composition and greeting each other in song or verse. It doesn't entirely surprise me, I have to say, because where I grew up, I believe there were remnants of that behaviour. Go raibh sé den nósa dhaoine bheith a cuma agus caintla chéile meas an deisbhéalachas meas scileanna cumadóireachta as being a normal way of being. But if that was pervasive across Ireland prior to the famine, it must have been an extraordinary thing to witness.
Iarla, what do you think about the Goodman song tunes? Like, for example, we're about to do Recognizable, and generally, what would you say about the Goodman song collection?
Well, I mean, Odhrán was mentioning there earlier, and you were saying it also, that there's a sort of a world that you inhabit, or it kind of inflates around you, sort of an envelope when you start singing a song. Any song, actually, to be honest. But there is a particularity to the Goodman world, I think. We would have some knowledge, sometimes good, sometimes faint, sometimes strong knowledge of some of the songs one would encounter, and other versions, the common versions. But there are specific characteristics to the Goodman versions, I think. Again and again one finds in the Goodman songs the recurrence of these patterns. And I find that they occur, but I'd love to know what you learned folks would think. They occur perhaps at the ends of lines. These sort of these flourishes of ornament, of sort of intervallic action. They wouldn't have been something I would have ever encountered in the song culture in Cooley.
So they're alien to the singing. Well, perhaps that's because they were taken down from pipers. What do you think?
I don't know, because there's these like da 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 dee 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 da da da. There's these quite expanded sort of emotions at the end of a line, with a kind of an ornamentation that is very unfamiliar to where I grew up, and they occur in the two songs we're going to be doing actually. These little da 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 dum, these like quick rhythmic.
I suspect, Iarla, that they're instrumental in character.
You think so because of the speed of the notes and so forth.
Yeah, they're not. They don't lie vocally.
No, they're hard to sing.
But I mean,
That's
and also they might even be spontaneous. You know, if the piping source were recorded on a different day, he might do something else.
Exactly.
So it's the palette of ornamentation. It's kind of maybe
that
the way that
explains
they
it.
will express themselves on a given day. But
Well, that's true. But imagine if a piper was giving his tunes to Goodman, he's gonna he's going to want to show off
few
a wee
extra
bit.
things, yeah.
a bit of a flourish here and there.
But I'll give you another one. Ni Nos and Kehi, which we know. I don't have the guitar here now, but or maybe I'll say. To me, that's very sweet, Tajana Bean.
Sin lagan cotinta.
Now, the tonality of that is very much a major. It's 1, 4, 5 chords. It's major, major, major all the way. But the version of Ni Nos and Kehi in the Goodman collection is minor.
Is there any chance you could play us the Goodman version then?
Well, I can't remember it, but sure, none better than Oran to play it. Yes, yeah. And yes, recognizably the same form, different tonality. Just would you play the conventional one? That's the first part. So play it again in the Goodman version.
Very different.
Gahol in Oran, that's beautiful. So I thought that was a good illustration of the words. Obviously, the text is going to fit. The form is similar, but the tonality is quite different.
Quite different. I mean, you can scan the words across it as it's being played,
Yes.
and you can imprint them. But as you mentioned, the common version is sort of imbued with a kind of a nostalgic sort of positive
Positive,
vibe.
yeah.
This is much more melancholy.
But actually, I think that goes right through the collection, because I think when you listen and play through a lot of the pieces in the collection, you hear a different musical language almost. even in the dance tunes, there's a modality.
Yes.
You know, that's quite different from the later reels that you get in the later 19th century. They're more sort of diatonic major scale. There's a lot of arpeggiated movement and scale-like movement, whereas this is more, they're more song-like.
I mean, they both have delights, right? I mean, I kind of, as a singer, my response is I'd like to sing both.
Yeah.
Yes.
But they have a very different mood structure.
Iarla, I must ask you, if we do, if you sing Recognizable, could you give us a sense of, and for the people watching, a sense of what the story is behind the song?
But it is a love song, of course. Is Fadadum aboard of a Kurturish McGraw. As with many love songs, it begins with the protagonist, who's usually male in this case, pining for his loved one, and there's a fair bit of that trope in our Irish traditional love song stuff, but there's a beautiful delicacy to the poetry of Recognizable. It really affects me very deeply, I must say. Is Iker tuerisk mogra Englaun tev du awagenoch Im ruagert hanfan A hawel ni vueras Keger huardies morano Yativ no twe Go buachgal no tro Ta kailin down daser On male shagami Oi skillien on schnachte Nahan alle erlien Da mechaniek kur hake Nire vada lamiek Elo har kashe Le gragal mochri Sni kriel sni lerhom Moshgel chorshis Ahachen brege De jenov nentli Kurbiet sluashie na grene Da ranig lembuen Nagus dwadig chun shlewem Rechnuk monadi The casog de ruig me Ignuk wasol
monadi marach nachich an stuere gostuamo no see bojas kircha agus tuoloch via kuacha leishia ser lativ o kualan luasco leishingui nach eving das nehenev a diarrhea go hard agus a lion lenne chele in chrivi o vain oni marshen dum fenig nadum hedvi le grammar fadon helering eirin on the law.
Odhrán, one thing I think about the Goodman collection that differs from other collections is he had a prime informant. In other words, there was one man who gave him a majority of the tunes he got from the oral tradition. Could you tell us a bit about that man, please?
Tomás Dahl o Kenedy, a blind piper from Kerry, and I actually met Nyasani Kenedy, who was a great descendant of his, and she confirmed that such a person did exist, and he was actually blind, because I know that some people have questioned that.
Explain to us how he got to be associated with Canon Goodman.
Well, he's referred to in the collection as an ex-piper, which implies that he no longer played the pipes. Mind you, his pipes were broken at one particular stage.
Well, it's a famous story. I've heard two different versions of the story, but there is enough central thread running through it we can be pretty sure of a lot of the facts. Could you just explain what happened?
Well, there's one is the folkloric story of why he could no longer play the pipes, and that is that he was tempted to play the fairy music, and he did play the fairy music, and he was suitably warned not to go near that repertoire again, but he couldn't desist, and ultimately paid the ultimate price of having his hands destroyed for having dabbled in that whole magical musical experience.
That story in other contexts before.
But that was the sort of folkloric story as to why Kenedy didn't play the pipes.
But there was another more practical and materialistic set of circumstances, wasn't there?
There was. So could I perhaps read you something? Because it's a reasonably long excerpt. It was a Father Casey, who was parish priest of the Western parish in my time, a mighty primitive...
Sorry to cut across, that'd be Ballyferty, who was the...
I think so, yeah. And he says that Father Casey was parish priest of the Western parish in my time, a mighty primitive old man, came into Dingle once a week, or at furthest a fortnight, to confession, and stopped off at Nelligan's, where he was always entertained most comfortably. And so the thing goes on, and then the young people should have a dance, and they had taken care before dinner to send to Dingle for a piper, on the bounds of which one lived, which would now and then make an incursion into Casey's territory in spite of him. I love the sound of that, territory of a piper and territory of the parish priest. But anyway, the piper, evidently in bodily fear of Casey, was induced to strike up, and jigs, reels and country dances were carried out with great vigour. So the parish priest became suitably upset at all this, and the quote goes on to say, his anger, Casey's, knew no bounds. He rushed over, laid hold of the unfortunate piper, kicked, cuffed and beat him mercifully, broke his pipes, and completely dispersed the whole assembly.
So Sean O'Cahasig, the Casey, the parish priest of Ballyferrita, bet Kenedy, broke his pipes. But the story didn't end there, because Kenedy appealed to the Bishop of Kerry, didn't he?
Yes, I think Kenedy intercepted the Bishop of Kerry, I think, on one particular occasion, and I have that quote here from as well. When Father Sean O'Cahasig was parish priest, here around the time of the famine, he put a stop to music, cards and dancing. Bishop Egan visited the parish to give the sacrament of confirmation to the children. On his way home, the bishop met a lame piper on the road, and we believe that was Kenedy. Lord Bishop, I ask your permission to play the pipes in company, as I am not able to provide for myself. Oh, said the bishop, Father Sean knows this case and understands what's appropriate.
So, the bishop had no mercy on Kenedy. Can you imagine the cost of acquiring a set of uilleann pipes immediately after the famine? It would have been impossible to destroy the man's livelihood. So we know from that he was a Catholic piper. He was stopped from playing by the Catholic priest of Ballyferrita, parish priest. So naturally enough, he betook himself to the Protestant colony in Ventry, where he met Canon Goodman, who took him in, and he shared his tunes with Canon Goodman. And it's our good fortune, you might say, that terrible irony that happened to Tom Kenedy, but it's to our benefit that he...
Yeah, but there was a very liberal cultural aesthetic, I think, amongst some of the Church of Ireland people at that time,
Yeah.
you know.
But are you suggesting from that, what was the
Goodman.
attitude of the Catholic Church towards music at that time?
Well, I'm not an authority on it, but I know that certain places like Donegal, there was a thing called Johnsonism, where all the fiddles were smashed. I presume that Casey disapproved of occasions where there was too much merriment, music, dancing, and temptation, I suppose, things like that.
Yeah. I had a discussion in 1998 with the parish priest of Ballyferrita, Tom Hickey, who just passed away last week. So I remember I was quite emotional at the time, thinking about poor Tom Kenedy and saying and remonstrating with the parish priest of Ballyferrita that there's a schism here now, a karmic schism, if you like, between the musicians and the clergy. The clergy have done a bad thing to us as a class of musicians. And he didn't say a word, but he dropped his head. He went into the parochial house. He came out with a beautiful Grundig top-class reel-to-reel tape recorder and presented it to me as reparations for an apology for what his predecessor had done. So we've discussed. Anything more you'd like to say about Tom Kenedy? Well, yeah, the numbers of tunes. What did Goodman get from Kenedy? Now, this is interesting because I've heard different numbers here. Or can I tell you the numbers that I have got?
Sure.
O'Neill in 1913 says Goodman's son Francis George told him that his father took down from Tom Kenedy several hundred tunes, not previously. So we already got several hundred. According to Wikipedia, 150 of the tunes were from Tom Kenedy, the famous Wikipedia. I couldn't see who did the edit because you can't see who edits Wikipedia. But according to Douglas de Hede, in a conversation with Canon Goodman, because they were obviously together, he's talking about Goodman. Dúirtélum gabhór sé 700 faun ó ein chan fibre dála wine. So he's saying he told me that he got 700 tunes from one blind piper alone.
That's about right, I think.
No, just to conclude here, the editor of Tunes of the Munster Pipe is Hugh Shields, and Volume 2, Hugh and his widow Lisa. Shields reports that Brown Brannock suggests that Hyde misheard 7 for several. Now, to me, that might be possible, but would Hyde and Goodman have been speaking English? Because that argument would only work if they were speaking English.
Both of them were Gaelic scholars.
Yeah, exactly.
So the probability is that they spoke Irish.
Yeah.
But also the fact that we have to second guess what Hyde said is a bit off. I mean, I think we have to take Hyde at his word. And it actually tallies with what Goodman has said in his introduction to his first volume. He said, "Here follows a collection of dance music of Munster, jigs, reels and hornpipes, written down for the most part from the playing of Thomas Kenedy, ex-piper."
Very good.
So I think
For the most part, that's the most telling phrase there.
Yeah. Therefore, Goodman is telling us in his own words that most of his tunes were written down from
That's
Kenedy.
good. Odhrán, I'll address this to you. It's something I've been interested in for a while. It's the K marks, what is called the K marks, the little letter K on many of the tunes, which I had made an assumption was tunes associated with Kenedy, although that is not is how it's described by the editors of the tunes of the Munster Pipers. It suggested it could be tunes from Kerry or from Andy Kenedy, the piper, or it's just that Goodman says they are my own settings. So I just wanted to say this to you, that while I was exploring Joyce's last manuscript, as I was reading his actual manuscript and the manuscripts that he borrowed from Goodman and copied into his last manuscript, I noticed there were tunes marked Kenedy, 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 Kenedy. So I was wondering, did they connect with the K marks? And I made a comparison, and sure enough, everything with Mark Kenedy had a K in it in the Goodman collection. So that led me to think that possibly the tunes were taken from Kenedy. What do you think about that?
I would consider that a very strong argument for believing that K actually does mean Kenedy. From my own point of view, I'm convinced that it means Kenedy. And if you look at the first volume, a lot of the beautiful song airs and the more unusual pieces have a K beside them, and that is the volume where Goodman states that he got a great deal of tunes from Kenedy. I know that Brendan Branagh presumed that it was probably Kenedy.
It's interesting. P.W. Joyce, Park Weston Joyce, was a polymath. He was a very talented man, but there is evidence that he was in Dublin at the same time as Goodman for a period of 14 years. I mean, Goodman was 6 months in Dublin, 6 months in Skibbereen, attending to his clerical duties, but nonetheless they were in proximity for a long time. And Joyce was studying at Trinity at night when Goodman was teaching there. So I'm sure their paths crossed. It seems logical to me that Goodman lends Joyce his manuscripts and indicates to him anywhere where you see a K, that's Kenedy. To me that's logical, that then Joyce writes Kenedy, Kenedy, Kenedy. What do you think?
Yeah, well, Goodman was sending manuscripts not only to Joyce, but he was sending them to Petrie. And Petrie was wearying of the amount of material he was getting from his piping source, because Petrie believed that the song tradition was a place to collect airs, not from instrumentalists. So that would be another reason to presume that K probably means Kenedy.
Yeah, that's very good. I know people might take a contrary view on that, but I think it's important that we just put the evidence up for people to decide for themselves.
I mean, one can make some sort of an academic argument to the contrary, but logically I would think a K on the manuscript implies Kenedy.
It's a nice thing to believe, anyway. So we should do a second song, Iarla, if you would bless us with that. It's Famine Galan, and it's number 1 in the collection. It's a famous song. It's probably what every whistle player learns first. But the lyrical content, to me, it strikes me as a type of ashling, whether it's a pure ashling or a kind of a retrograde type of ashling. But what are your thoughts on the content of the lyrics then?
Well, Odhrán has a knowledge about the deeper origins of the song, and maybe we can hear about that in a moment, because I'd like to hear what that is. Something I haven't really considered, but the drama, if you like, of the song is very much of the character of a vision song. There's this dream suffused with light, the whole idea of light appearing as a sort of giver of knowledge, of insight, of change. It's all inside that song, and that predominates as a characteristic in the ashling form as well, the vision song. But what's missing from the Famine Galan is the political allegory.
Yes.
That's absent because it isn't really an ashling as such.
It's more carnal, isn't it?
You could say that, yes. You could, yes. Thankfully, you said that.
Yeah.
But it's very beautiful.
But she's having none of it anyway.
Well, this is always the
That's the verse we weren't taught in school.
Yeah. It shares that as well with the ashling, actually. The approach of the poet to the female figure in the ashling is never completed. The female character, who's an allegorical, figurative presence symbolizing Ireland, speaks cryptically and then sort of dematerializes. And in the Fáinne Gaelin Lay, you have kind of a rejection and a kind of again this bright light and then kind of disappearing act. So there are fascinating overlapping characteristics. Most peculiar, and it adds to I think Goodman's version, if I may say, the music of the Goodman collection does much to accentuate.
It's very beautiful.
That feeling.
It doesn't.
Would you agree?
Yeah, the music seems to almost paint a picture of what's in the poem.
Sinead the Nas na Síl ag Tacht. It's as if they were these presences, not just light, but that they were actual beings of light
approaching,
coming over the horizon. These ideas, these sort of presences of poetic insight. It's very, very beautiful. But Odhrán, you were mentioning to me before that the origins of Fáinne Gaelin Lay are more likely to be quite ancient.
Yeah, I mean, it's just Professor Sean O'Toma in his book Gra and Aran Nina considers it to be one of the oldest songs in the tradition. He calls it a vision poem, but it's vision without any allegorical content. And I remember discussing this with my father, and he was very taken with the song, always was, but he said it's enigmatic as well, because you see, the woman may be a fairy woman or she may be an earthly woman, and we're not quite sure. It's left hanging in a sense. Firstly, she has a milking pail in her hand, which would make us think that she's earthly. But then the fact that she's leaving with the light coming from the south would suggest a fairy origin.
Fascinating.
So it's interesting.
Madenmach, the Gausamach, Ruachalochalein. Vin Saura Tacht, on Chrivlenash, is Lunrochte ongrein. Hashteldom trivial to put. Is a bond to me in a ray, yoing lemash, achan huel and das le Fáinne Gaelin Lay. Ní raibh brog na stock, caip na cloak my story nog on spare. Ach falt fionn org, she's go tre, ik fas go bar an Vi call on crue to ken the glack, rucht bejas skeef de rug bargan Venus das le foin gallantly. The Hagen read och skis le mash Rin shachlas den Sigmagule vi stamwiev gepros Marvni naskaring rivle Shedwer chilum o mikshwem Isquieler shul merik Shin iedenes Nasiel shetacht le foin gallantly. Madinmach de rausemach vuchaloch alleen an saure tacht an grievlen ash is lunrochte oning rein hashteldom trivalte purt is a bond to me in a ray ke yoing lemesh ach an chuelen das le foing gallantly foing gallantly.
Now, I'd like to thank you both for sharing this occasion, Iarla, and your knowledge.
Great pleasure.
And it's been a very interesting discourse, I think. And Iarla, your singing is absolutely fantastic, as of ever. And Odhrán, your playing is magnificent.
Thank you.
So it's nice that we could get together.
I must say, when I was reconstructing some of the Goodman songs, it was always my intention that they would come back into tradition, so that, in a sense, the collection was almost a storehouse that was waiting for the right time to be just reintroduced back into the source areas, and to see something or to hear something as beautiful as Iarla singing Recognizable, it goes full circle for me. It's absolutely beautiful to hear those variants coming to life again.
Very true, and I think we should acknowledge the great work done by ITMA, the Irish Traditional Music Archive, in this regard. For starters, they published the collection and then they've scanned it all, put it online. There's constant work going up there. They've scanned the 80 new song titles. So I think the Traditional Music Archive deserves all our support. And I think I would say to all musicians, young musicians looking at this series, Drawing from the Well, and different musicians, to make use of the archive. And you can access an awful lot online. And the people are very welcome here. They'll make you a cup of tea and you can sit down and leaf your way through the collections. Everyone's been very helpful to us, and I've had a ball talking to you esteemed gentlemen. And
So have I.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.